Japan's story begins long before emperors, samurai, or bustling cities. It begins in mist and legend, on a chain of volcanic islands that rose from the ocean like a dragon awakening from sleep. Here, mountains erupted with fire, coastlines shifted with relentless tectonic force, and over thousands of years, a culture unlike any other slowly took shape. It's a history marked by resilience shaped by earthquakes and typhoons, iced by invasions that faltered against storms, and by ideas carried across the seas. This is not just a story of emperors and wars. It's a story of transformation, from prehistoric tribes to divine kingship, from feudal warlords to industrial power, from isolation to global influence. Across these islands, traditions have been preserved with astonishing tenacity, while waves of change repeatedly reshaped society. In this journey, we will travel through 50 chapters, tracing every era from myth to modernity in one continuous thread. You'll hear of shaman, queens, and poetic courts, brutal civil wars and foreign ships that shattered centuries of isolation, and of a nation that emerged from the ashes of war to redefine its place in the world. So settle in. Imagine the waves against rocky shores, the rustle of bamboo in the wind, the distant echo of temple bells. This is the entire history of Japan. The birth of the islands, myth, and geology. Long before written history, Japan's origins were explained through myth. According to the ancient Kojiki and Nihon Shoki chronicles, the gods Izanagi and Izanami stood upon the floating bridge of heaven and stirred the ocean with a jeweled spear. As they lifted it, drops fell and hardened into the islands of Japan. These myths gave the land a divine birth, not just a place, but a sacred realm forged by heavenly hands. Beneath the myth lies a violent geological reality. Japan sits atop the convergence of four major tectonic plates: the Pacific, Philippine Sea, Eurasian, and North American. Over millions of years, subduction and volcanic activity raised chains of islands from the sea. Massive earthquakes and eruptions shaped its rugged terrain, creating steep mountains and fertile valleys that would profoundly influence how its early people lived. The islands were never static. Coastlines shifted repeatedly, sometimes dramatically, altering migration routes and food sources. Volcanic eruptions fertilized the soil while also wiping out settlements. Typhoons carved into the land and memory alike. To live here was to adapt, to respect nature's power. It's little wonder that Japan's earliest myths speak of gods stirring the sea, because in truth, it was the earth itself that stirred constantly beneath their feet. Jōmon culture, hunters, gatherers, and clay figurines, between roughly 14,000 and 300 BCE, long before rice agriculture arrived, Japan was home to the Jōmon people, named for the cord-marked pottery they left behind. Their pottery, among the oldest in the world, shows that these were not fleeting bands of nomads. They built semi-permanent settlements, fished rivers and coasts, gathered nuts and plants, and hunted deer and boar in the dense forests. The Jōmon lived in pit dwellings, insulated with earth and thatch, clustered around rich food sources. Middens, ancient trash heaps, revealed diets rich in shellfish, acorns, and marine life. They developed intricate stone tools, bone implements, and nets for fishing, reflecting a deep adaptation to their environment. Perhaps their most intriguing legacy is the dogger, small clay figurines with exaggerated features, often mysterious and stylized. Scholars debate their purpose: fertility symbols, protective charms, or spiritual effigies. Whatever their meaning, they show a culture with rich spiritual beliefs long before organized religion. Unlike many parts of the world, agriculture didn't immediately replace hunting and gathering here. Jōmon society thrived for millennia in relative stability, showing that civilization takes many forms, not all built on conquest or farming. Yayoi Revolution, rice, metal, and social hierarchies around 300 BCE. New people and technologies arrived, likely from the Korean peninsula. This Yayoi culture transformed Japan forever. Wet-trace agriculture took root in the temperate lowlands, enabling population growth and more complex societies. With rice came surplus, and with surplus came hierarchy. Communities began building raised granaries to store harvests. Some families gained control over land and food, creating early forms of social stratification. Weapons made of iron and bronze appeared, along with mirrors and bells, items linked to ritual and prestige. Yayoi pottery was plainer but more practical than Jōmon's decorative styles, reflecting a shift toward utility and farming life. The introduction of metal technology also meant sharper tools, more efficient agriculture, and deadlier weapons. Conflicts between communities grew more organized, with evidence of fortified settlements and mass graves suggesting early warfare. This was not just technological change, it was the birth of a new society. The rhythm of life shifted from seasonal foraging to cycles of planting and harvest. Japan was stepping into an agricultural world, laying the foundation for kingdoms to emerge. The rise of Yamatai and Queen Himiko. As Yayoi society expanded, power began to consolidate in certain regions. By the 3rd century CE, Chinese historical records describe a powerful kingdom called Yamatai, led by a shaman queen named Himiko. She ruled not through brute force but through spiritual authority, communicating with the gods while her brother handled state affairs. Himiko's reign marked one of Japan's earliest recorded political structures. Envoys from Yamatai sent tribute to the Chinese Wei court, receiving titles in return. This connection shows that early Japan was not isolated. It was already part of a wider East Asian diplomatic world. Archaeological finds of large keyhole-shaped burial mounds, kofan, mirrors, and weapons suggest a stratified society with elites consolidating power. Though scholars debate the exact location of Yamatai, its existence points to the emergence of centralized rule, diplomacy, and ritual authority. Himiko's death led to internal turmoil, indicating how fragile early political unity could be. Yet her story lingers as a powerful symbol, the mysterious queen who wielded divine legitimacy at the dawn of Japanese statehood. Early Shinto beliefs and kami worship running through all these developments was a distinctive spiritual worldview. Shinto, or the way of the gods? Unlike imported religions, Shinto had no founder, sacred texts, or rigid doctrine. It grew organically from a reverence for kami spirits residing in natural phenomena, ancestors, and extraordinary beings. Sacred groves, waterfalls, and mountains became sites of worship. Early rituals involved purification, offerings, and seasonal festivals, marking agricultural cycles. Rather than distant deities, kami were part of the living landscape, demanding respect but also offering protection. Shinto beliefs intertwined seamlessly with political authority. Rulers claimed descent from powerful kami, legitimizing their status. Over time, the imperial family would trace its lineage to Amaterasu, the sun goddess, a claim that would give Japan's emperors their divine aura for centuries. In these centuries before centralized statehood, religion was not separate from life. It was the forest, the river, the storm, a world where the spiritual and natural were one. The legendary Emperor Emu and the imperial line, the story of Japan's imperial family, begins not with a historical figure, but with a myth that shaped a nation's identity.
According to the ancient chronicles, the Kojiki and Nihon Shoki, Emu was a direct descendant of the sun goddess Amaterasu, sent to Earth to bring order and divine rule.
Around 660 BCE, Emu and his followers supposedly left Kushu, journeying eastward in what's depicted as a divinely guided conquest, overcoming local tribes and natural obstacles. At Yamato, he established his rule, and this is traditionally marked as the founding of the Japanese nation. While historians debate the accuracy of this story, its cultural impact is undeniable. For centuries, the imperial line's legitimacy was tied to its divine ancestry, setting it apart from other monarchies of the world. Unlike Europe, where royal houses rose and fell, Japan cultivated the image of an unbroken line from the gods themselves. Even into the 20th century, this myth would be invoked to justify imperial power. Beneath the mythology, however, are hints of genuine historical shifts. Archaeological evidence suggests that power was consolidating in the Yamato plain around this time, with emerging elites controlling agriculture, metallurgy, and trade routes. The figure of Emu likely reflects a real period of clan unification, when a dominant group began to extend its influence over other regional powers, blending myth and politics. This blending of sacred myth and political power became a hallmark of Japan's identity. The emperor wasn't just a ruler, he was a living link to heaven, a concept that would persist even through shogunates, wars, and modern constitutions. The legend of Emu is less about proving history and more about explaining why Japan saw itself as divinely unique, setting the stage for centuries of centralized symbolism. And so, Japan's recorded history begins not with cold facts, but with a story whispered by gods and echoed by emperors. The Asuka period. Buddhism arrives. The Asuka period, 538 to 710, marks one of the most transformative moments in Japanese history when Buddhism crossed the sea from Korea and China. The arrival of this foreign faith shook Japan's traditional spiritual foundations. Initially, Buddhism was introduced by Baekje, a Korean kingdom, who gifted the Yamato court with statues and scriptures. But this gift was also a diplomatic move, aligning Japan with the prestigious civilization of the mainland. The reaction was mixed. Powerful clans like the Soga embraced Buddhism, seeing its political and cultural value. Others, like the Mononobe Nakatomi, resisted fiercely, viewing it as a threat to the native kami and their political influence. What followed was not just a religious debate, but a power struggle cloaked in theology. Temples were built, idols enshrined, but also burned in opposition. Eventually, the Soga emerged victorious, paving the way for Buddhism's rise. Buddhism didn't replace Shinto. Instead, it wove itself into the existing spiritual tapestry. Temples rose beside shrines, monks prayed alongside Shinto priests, and sacred mountains became shared spaces. Over time, Buddhism introduced new ideas of cosmology, ethics, and even government, influencing architecture, art, and philosophy. It offered visions of paradise, rebirth, and karmic order, concepts previously alien to the islands. Perhaps most significantly, Buddhism acted as a bridge between Japan and the wider Asian world. Through it came writing systems, diplomatic missions, and artistic techniques. The Asuka period turned Japan from an isolated cluster of tribes into a participant in a continental civilization, with Buddhism as the conduit. Prince Shotoku and the 17-article constitution, few figures loom as large over early Japan as Prince Shotoku, Wutsise da Liurar. A regent and visionary, Shotoku was instrumental in laying the ideological groundwork for centralized government, inspired by Chinese Confucianism and Buddhism. He issued the famous 17-article constitution in 604, not a constitution in the modern sense, but a set of moral and administrative principles intended to guide court officials. This document emphasized harmony, respect for the emperor, and Buddhist Confucian ethics. It encouraged officials to avoid factionalism, respect hierarchy, and uphold justice. At its heart was the idea that the ruler was at the center of a moral universe, and bureaucrats were expected to behave with virtue, not personal ambition. Shotoku also established official diplomatic relations with China's Sui dynasty, famously sending envoys that referred to the Japanese emperor as the Son of Heaven, on par with the Chinese emperor, a bold move reflecting growing national confidence. He promoted the adoption of Chinese-style bureaucracy, including ranking systems for officials, laying the foundation for a more organized state. Under Shotoku's patronage, Buddhism flourished. He commissioned the construction of temples such as Horyuji, one of the oldest wooden buildings still standing today. His reign marked a turning point where Japan looked outward to learn, but inward to define itself, blending foreign models with native traditions. Taika reforms, building a centralized state. In 645, Japan underwent a revolution in governance known as the Taika Reform's Great Change. Triggered by the dramatic coup against the Soga clan, these reforms aimed to centralize power under the emperor, inspired by the Chinese Tang dynasty's bureaucratic model. The reforms declared that all land belonged to the emperor, effectively dismantling the power bases of local clans. A census and land redistribution followed. Taxes were standardized, and provinces were organized under imperial officials. New administrative titles and ranks were created, establishing a national bureaucracy where loyalty was owed not to clans, but to the imperial court. This was a monumental shift. The old clan-based system had been built on personal loyalties, ancestral lands, and hereditary power. The Taika reforms sought to replace it with state structures, codified law, and centralized authority. Roads were planned, records kept, and laws written. Though implementation was uneven, the intent was clear. Japan was becoming a true centralized state. The reforms also reflected Japan's growing sophistication. Instead of passively imitating China, Japan was actively adapting Chinese models to fit its own needs, a pattern that would repeat for centuries. The Taika reforms marked the beginning of an imperial state that saw itself as more than a collection of clans, but as a unified nation under a divine ruler. Nara, period. Japan's first permanent capital. Before the 8th century, Japan's capital moved frequently, often with each new emperor. But in 710, the court made a decisive change. They established Haijukyo Nara as the first permanent capital, modeled after the Chinese Tang capital of Chang'an. This was more than urban planning. It was a statement of permanence and sophistication. Nara was laid out on a grid pattern with wide avenues, palace compounds, and temples. Bureaucrats filled government offices, monks chanted in towering temples, and scribes recorded edicts. The capital became the center of administration, religion, and culture, radiating imperial power across the islands. Buddhism continued to flourish, with massive temple complexes like Todaji being constructed, home to the great Buddha statue. The imperial court sponsored monasteries, believing their prayers would protect and legitimize the state. This intertwining of religion and governance reached unprecedented levels. But with permanence came new problems. Powerful Buddhist institutions began influencing politics, sometimes overshadowing the emperor himself. Factional struggles, disease outbreaks, and the challenge of managing a growing bureaucracy all emerged during this period. Still, the Nara era stands as the moment Japan truly embraced statehood, complete with a capital that symbolized its ambitions. Keiankyo, the new capital, and court culture in the year 794. Emperor Kanmu made a historic decision. He moved the imperial capital from Nara to a new city called Heiankyo, known today as Kyoto. This marked the beginning of the Heian period, a golden age of aristocratic refinement that would define Japan's classical culture for centuries. Unlike Nara, which had been dominated by powerful Buddhist institutions, Heian was carefully planned to separate politics from the religious power structures that had begun to overshadow the throne. The city was laid out on a grand grid, inspired by the Chinese Tang capital of Chang'an, a city of symmetry, order, and imperial dignity. Heiankyo became the glittering stage upon which the aristocracy performed their roles. The emperor was at its symbolic center, but the daily rhythm of power was carried out in the sprawling imperial court, where nobles competed in rituals, poetry, and etiquette. Everything from the way one dressed to how a poem was composed was governed by an intricate set of unspoken rules, where beauty and refinement equaled prestige. This was not an era of conquest or great military expansion. Instead, cultural expression became the battlefield, and words were sharper than swords. Aristocrats spent their days writing waka poetry, composing elegant letters, and mastering court games like Go and Komori. The changing seasons inspired elaborate festivals, with cherry blossoms and autumn leaves setting the tone for romantic encounters and poetic rivalries. Heianka was also a place of mysticism and ritual. Shinto ceremonies intertwined with esoteric Buddhism, and nobles consulted diviners, Onmuji court sorcerers, and astrologers before making important decisions. The supernatural was woven into daily life. Illnesses were attributed to spirits, political misfortunes to curses, and exorcisms were held within palace walls. For over 4 centuries, Heiankyo stood as the heart of Japanese civilization, producing some of the country's most iconic cultural achievements. But beneath the serene surface of this courtly world, new forces were stirring, setting the stage for dramatic shifts to come. The Fujiwara Regency, power behind the throne. While emperors sat on the throne, real power during much of the Heian period rested in the hands of the Fujiwara clan. Through strategic marriages, political maneuvering, and relentless ambition, the Fujiwara effectively controlled the imperial court without needing to wear the crown. Their rise is one of the most brilliant examples of political subtlety in Japanese history. The Fujiwara perfected the art of marrying their daughters to emperors, ensuring that future emperors were born of Fujiwara mothers. Then, when these child emperors ascended the throne, Fujiwara men, often uncles or grandfathers, would serve as regents sessho or chief advisors kampaku, exercising power on their behalf. Over time, this became institutionalized, and the Fujiwara ruled for generations through a web of family ties rather than military might. Their dominance brought a long period of stability to the court. Bureaucratic systems matured, and the arts flourished under their patronage. They sponsored temples, sponsored literature, and hosted the grand seasonal festivals that defined aristocratic life. The Fujiwara palaces became centers of refined culture, where courtiers competed to display elegance, wit, and poetic skill. But their power also came with increasing detachment from the provinces. While Fujiwara courtiers perfected the art of politics in Heiankyo, far from the capital, local clans and warriors were growing stronger, managing their own lands with little oversight. This growing divide between courtly refinement and provincial realities would prove critical in the centuries to come. The Fujiwara era was one of glittering sophistication, but also a slow drift toward vulnerability. In controlling the court so effectively, they inadvertently created space for new kinds of power to emerge outside it. Life at court, poetry, aesthetics. And the tale of Genji daily life in the Heian court was a world of beauty, ritual, and words. To thrive in this rarefied environment, one needed not brute strength or political cunning, but a finely honed sense of aesthetics. Courtiers were judged by their handwriting, their ability to compose poetry on the spot, and the subtlety of their perfumes. Everything from clothing colors to the arrangement of flowers was a language of status. One of the greatest cultural treasures of this period is the tale of Genji, written by the noblewoman Murasaki Shikibu in the early 11th century. It's often called the world's first novel. This sweeping narrative follows the romantic exploits of Prince Genji, offering a vivid glimpse into courtly life, its passions, intrigues, and fleeting beauty. Through her work, Murasaki captured the emotional and psychological depth of Heian aristocracy in a way that remains astonishingly modern. Court diaries, poetry anthologies, and love letters have survived in abundance, giving us an intimate portrait of a society obsessed with refinement. Poetry contests were serious affairs, and a perfectly turned verse could win not just admiration, but political favor. Aristocrats wrote poems on fans, on sliding doors, even on the backs of leaves, delivering them with ritualized grace. Heian women, particularly those of the aristocracy, wielded considerable cultural power through their writings. Many of the era's most famous works were written by women in kana script, a uniquely Japanese writing system that allowed for personal expression outside of Chinese scholarly tradition. In their private diaries, they chronicled love affairs, rivalries, and the quiet loneliness of palace life. This courtly world was dazzling but fragile, a bubble of elegance floating above a changing society, unaware that the ground beneath it was slowly shifting. Rise of provincial warriors, the seeds of the samurai, while nobles in Heiankyo composed poetry and performed rituals. In the provinces, a very different type of power was taking root. Local aristocrats and landowners, tasked with managing imperial estates, began relying on armed retainers to protect their lands, enforce their will, and collect taxes. Over time, these provincial guards evolved into a distinct warrior class, the samurai. Initially, the court viewed these warriors as useful but distant tools. However, as the central government struggled to maintain control over distant provinces, these warriors began to build their own networks of loyalty and power, often tied to specific clans. Families like the Taira and Minamoto gained prominence as military families who could both serve the court and pursue their own interests. Unlike the refined aristocrats, these warriors valued loyalty, martial skill, and practical leadership. They lived closer to the realities of land disputes, banditry, and local politics. 8. While Heian courtiers floated in a world of elegance, the samurai were forging the values of discipline, honor, and military prowess that would one day define Japan's future. By the late Heian period, the imperial court's reliance on these warriors had become a double-edged sword. They needed them to maintain order, but in empowering them, they planted the seeds of their own displacement. The samurai were no longer mere provincial tools, they were becoming a class unto themselves, ambitions and rivalries that would soon reshape the political landscape. Decline of the court, factions and feuds. By the 12th century, the elegant world of Heian aristocracy was beginning to crack from within. Factional disputes among noble families weakened the court's unity, and corruption eroded its authority. The Fujiwara clan's dominance waned as retired emperors began to exert political influence through a system called insei, or cloistered government, where emperors abdicated but continued to rule behind the scenes. This dual structure of cloistered emperors and court nobility bred rivalries and confusion, with multiple power centers vying for influence. Meanwhile, local governance grew increasingly independent. Tax revenues dwindled, the court's ability to project power into the provinces faltered, and provincial military clans filled the vacuum. Natural disasters, famines, and outbreaks of disease added to the instability. In Heiankyo, while nobles continued to hold poetry contests and festivals, real power was slipping through their fingers. The once unshakable imperial court was becoming a ceremonial center rather than a governing one. This decline did not happen overnight, but by the end of the Heian period, the balance of power had fundamentally shifted. The stage was set for a dramatic confrontation between the aristocracy and the emerging warrior class, a clash that would bring centuries of courtly rule to a close. The Taira and Minamoto clans, new power players in the final centuries of the Heian period. Japan's delicate aristocratic world began to crack under its own weight. The imperial court in Kyoto grew increasingly ceremonial and detached, more concerned with poetry, aesthetics, and rank than with governing the provinces. As a result, real control over land and people slowly shifted into the hands of regional warrior families who acted as enforcers and estate managers for absentee nobles. These warriors weren't initially noble conquerors, they were practical. Hardened men who maintained order in remote areas, fought off bandits, and collected taxes. Over generations, their military skills and local influence gave them power that rivaled Kyoto's elites. Among these rising families, too, stood taller than the rest, the Taira Heike and the Minamoto Genji. Both clans traced their lineage to imperial princes of earlier generations, giving them the pedigree needed to maneuver within the court while also commanding large military forces. The Taira clan, based in western Japan, excelled under the cunning leadership of Taira no Kiyomori. He was a master of court politics, a shrewd diplomat, and an ambitious leader who saw beyond traditional aristocratic boundaries. By marrying his daughter into the imperial family and placing his grandson on the throne, Kiyomori effectively transformed the court into a puppet stage for Taira ambitions. Meanwhile, the Minamoto clan, centered in the eastern provinces, developed differently. Rather than dominating the capital, they focused on building strong provincial power bases among local warrior networks. Eastern Japan, with its wide plains and warrior culture, gave rise to a different breed of samurai, less refined, more independent, and fiercely loyal to their leaders. The Minamoto's previous attempts at rebellion had led to temporary defeats and exile, but their resilience and control of key territories like the Kanto region made them a sleeping giant. By the late 12th century, tension between Western court-backed Taira dominance and Eastern provincial Minamoto strength had reached a breaking point. Kiyomori's increasingly authoritarian moves, including the placement of a child emperor and Toku on the throne, alienated other noble families and warrior groups. Discontent festered in the provinces, creating fertile ground for rebellion. Minamoto seized this moment to re-emerge from the shadows, led by the calculating and patient Minamoto no Yoritomo, who had survived the Taira purges as a boy. The rivalry between these two clans was not just a political struggle, it was a collision between two worlds. The elegant but brittle Heian court and the rising warrior class that would soon dominate Japan. This clash would explode into open warfare and permanently reshape the country's political landscape, marking the end of aristocratic supremacy and the dawn of samurai rule. The Genpei War, Samurai Civil War. In 1180, the simmering tensions finally erupted into the Genpei War, a 5-year struggle that would determine Japan's future. Unlike previous rebellions, this was not a skirmish between small factions. It was a full-blown civil war between two great warrior families, involving nearly every corner of the Japanese archipelago. The war began when Prince Mochihito, a rival imperial claimant, called on the Minamoto to rise against Taira domination. Yoritomo seized this opportunity, rallying eastern warriors to his banner, Da. His headquarters in Kamakura became the nerve center of resistance. Far from the political intrigues of Kyoto, Yoritomo's greatest strength wasn't just his military ability, but his strategic patience. Rather than rushing into Kyoto himself, he consolidated power in the east, delegating command to brilliant lieutenants. Chief among them was his half-brother, Minamoto no Yoshitsune, a young and daring general whose tactical genius would become the stuff of legend. Yoshitsune led lightning-fast campaigns across Japan, defeating Taira forces at Yuji and capturing key strongholds through a mixture of surprise attacks, forced marches, and audacious maneuvers over mountain passes. The Taira, for their part, still controlled the imperial court and wielded the emperor as a symbol of legitimacy. But their position was weakening. Many former allies abandoned them as Yoritomo's influence spread. Taira forces retreated westward along the inland sea, attempting to regroup. The war became increasingly brutal. Battles were fought not only on land but also at sea, marking one of the earliest large-scale naval conflicts in Japanese history. Tactics evolved rapidly during this period, shifting from ritualized one-on-one duels to coordinated strategies involving massed archery, cavalry charges, and fortified positions. The decisive moment came in 1185 at the Battle of Dan-Nuer, fought on the waters of the Shimonoseki Strait. The Taira fleet, carrying the child emperor on Toku and the imperial regalia, faced the Minamoto in a desperate naval engagement. Betrayals within Taira ranks crippled their formations, and Yoshitsune exploited the tides to devastating effect. As the Taira forces collapsed, their leaders unwilling to be captured drowned themselves in the young emperor at sea. The imperial regalia was partly recovered, but the Taira clan was annihilated. The Genpei War was more than a power struggle, it was a transformative moment. The aristocratic world of Heian was shattered, and the samurai class proved it could not only fight, but rule. Yoritomo stood at the apex of power, not as an emperor, but as something entirely new. The birth of the shogunate. Kamakura rises after his victory. Minamoto, no Yoritomo, made a bold and unprecedented choice. He did not seize the imperial throne nor try to become a court aristocrat. Instead, he created a new system of rule, one that would dominate Japan for centuries. In 1192, he received the title of Sei Tai Shogun, or Barbarian Subduing Generalissimo, from the emperor. Though the title sounded like a military commission, Yoritomo transformed it into the foundation of real political power. In Kamakura, a coastal city far from Kyoto, he established the Bakufu, literally tent government, the first shogunate, unlike the highly centralized imperial court. The Kamakura shogunate was military in nature, with authority delegated to trusted vassals across the provinces. He appointed Shugo military governors and Jittu estate stewards to oversee provinces and lands, ensuring loyalty directly to Kamakura rather than the distant court. This created a dual structure. The emperor remained as a symbolic figure in Kyoto, but the shogun controlled the levers of real governance. This shift represented a fundamental change in how power operated. Aristocrats once ruled through birthright and ceremony. Now power depended on land, military strength, and loyalty networks. Yoritomo's government was efficient, pragmatic, and built to endure. He carefully rewarded loyal vassals and kept potential rivals in check through surveillance and administrative control. Culturally, this period also marked the emergence of samurai values in governance. Bureaucracy was streamlined. Law and order were enforced with severity, and the emphasis was on practical control rather than refined ritual. Kamakura became the beating heart of a new Japan, one ruled not by poets and courtiers, but by warriors and administrators. Samurai culture and Bushido beginnings. As the Kamakura shogunate took root, Japan underwent a profound cultural transformation. For centuries, the elegant courtly values of the Heian period had shaped the elite mindset. Refined aesthetics, poetic sensitivity, and intricate rituals defined power. But under samurai rule, a new ethos began to dominate society, one centered on discipline, loyalty, and martial virtue. Samurai were no longer just provincial enforcers. They became the ruling class, and their ideals began to shape everything from politics to literature. Unlike the aristocrats of Kyoto, the samurai lived in regions often marked by harsh terrain, unpredictable conflicts, and the constant need for readiness. Their worldview was forged in battlefields, not salons. They valued loyalty to one's lordgiri above personal gain, courage in the face of death, and an austere lifestyle that emphasized duty over luxury. While the formal codification of Bushido, the way of the warrior, would come later, its foundations were laid during this period through oral traditions, clan customs, and emerging warrior literature. Religion played a crucial role in shaping samurai identity. Zen Buddhism, with its emphasis on discipline, meditation, and embracing impermanence, resonated deeply with the warrior mindset. It provided psychological tools to remain calm in combat and to accept death without fear. Meanwhile, Shinto beliefs tied warriors to their ancestral lands and kami, reinforcing notions of duty and sacred lineage. Confucian ethics also influenced samurai hierarchies, emphasizing loyalty to superiors and the importance of order. Together, these philosophies created a complex moral code that blended spirituality, duty, and military practicality. This new culture was reflected in literature and art. The Heike Monogatari tale of the Heike, an epic recounting the Genpei War, became a defining text portraying the tragic fall of the Taira clan and the impermanence of glory. Samurai recited its verses before battle, reminding themselves of fate's fickleness. Paintings and sculptures shifted too, depicting armored warriors, heroic exploits, and scenes of nature that evoked both serenity and transience. Samurai families trained their sons from youth in archery, swordsmanship, horse riding, and strategy. Unlike the largely hereditary bureaucratic roles of aristocrats, samurai leadership was earned through martial skill and loyalty. Rising through ranks required proving oneself on the battlefield, and betrayal was met with ruthless consequences. Over time, this system produced a class of disciplined warrior administrators who could fight fiercely yet govern effectively, setting the stage for centuries of samurai dominance. By the end of the Kamakura period, the samurai had developed a distinct identity that blended military power with moral philosophy. They were no longer just soldiers. They were the ideological backbone of the state. Their code would evolve, harden, and eventually become the soul of Japanese society for generations to come. The Mongol invasions, typhoons, and divine winds. In the late 13th century, the Kamakura shogunate faced an unprecedented threat from abroad. Across the sea, the Mongol Empire, the largest contiguous empire in history, had conquered China and Korea. Turning its gaze toward the islands of Japan, Kublai Khan, the grandson of Genghis Khan and founder of the Yuan dynasty, sent envoys to Japan demanding tribute. Confident in their divine mandate and isolation, the Japanese refused. What followed were two of the most dramatic invasions in medieval Japanese history, testing the young samurai government to its limits. The first invasion came in 1274, when a Mongol-Korean Chinese fleet carrying tens of thousands of soldiers landed on Tsushima and Hakata Bay in northern Kyushu. The Japanese defenders, mostly local samurai, expected formal duels, but the Mongols fought in terrifying new ways. They used coordinated infantry attacks, superior archery, and explosive projectiles, overwhelming the defenders with disciplined formations and psychological warfare. It was a shock to the samurai, who were accustomed to more individualized combat. But before the Mongols could press deeper inland, a sudden violent storm struck, destroying much of their fleet. The surviving invaders retreated, and the Japanese attributed this miracle to the kami, seeing it as divine protection. Kublai Khan was not deterred. He spent years building an even larger invasion force, and in 1281, he launched the second invasion, this time with two massive fleets from Korea and southern China, totaling over 140,000 men. The Japanese, having learned from the first attack, constructed defensive walls along Hakata Bay, fortified coastal positions, and mobilized samurai from across the archipelago. For weeks they harassed the Mongol fleets with night raids and small boat attacks, preventing a unified landing. Then came the decisive twist. A typhoon swept through Kyushu, devastating the anchored Mongol fleet. Ships smashed against each other in the coast, soldiers drowned by the thousands, and the invasion collapsed into chaos. Once again, Japan was spared, and the storm was immortalized as the kamikaze, or divine wind. This term would echo centuries later during World War II, symbolizing both desperation and divine protection. Although victorious, the invasions strained the Kamakura shogunate severely. Defending the realm required enormous mobilization, yet there were no new lands to distribute as rewards, unlike in typical samurai campaigns. This created financial hardship and growing discontent among warriors, weakening the shogunate's political stability over time. Moreover, Japan's victory reinforced xenophobic confidence. Many believed their islands were divinely protected, encouraging a sense of spiritual uniqueness that would persist for centuries. The Mongol invasions were more than military confrontations. They were formative national experiences. They united samurai under a common threat, inspired lasting myths, and revealed both the strengths and vulnerabilities of Japan's feudal order. The image of divine winds protecting the sacred islands became embedded in the Japanese psyche, a powerful story of survival at the edge of a vast empire. Fall of Kamakura, Go-Daigo's challenge. By the early 14th century, the once formidable Kamakura shogunate had grown complacent. For decades, the HJ regents had ruled from behind the scenes, controlling the shogun like a puppet. But cracks were forming. Economic strain from the Mongol invasions and the growing dissatisfaction among provincial warriors weakened their grip. In Kyoto, Emperor Go-Daigo watched these developments with quiet ambition. Unlike his imperial predecessors, he wasn't content to remain a ceremonial figure. He wanted real power, and he intended to take it back. Go-Daigo launched a bold rebellion in 1331, defying the shogunate's authority. The Kamakura Bakufu responded swiftly, forcing the emperor into exile. But Go-Daigo wasn't finished. With the help of loyalist warriors like Kusunoki, Masashi Ige, a brilliant strategist known for his cunning defenses, and Ashikaga Takauji, powerful samurai general, the imperial cause gained momentum. In 1333, Takauji shockingly betrayed the Kamakura shogunate and sided with the emperor. His armies marched on the capital, crushing HJ forces in a series of decisive battles. The fall of Kamakura was dramatic. The HJ clan committed mass suicide at their family temple as flames consumed their stronghold. For the first time in over a century, imperial power seemed restored. Go-Daigo returned to Kyoto triumphantly, determined to re-establish the ancient Ryosuryō system of centralized imperial governance. But his reforms alienated the samurai who had fought for him. Instead of rewarding warriors with land, he offered court ranks and titles, ignoring their expectations. Discontent simmered. Ashikaga Takauji, feeling sidelined and insulted, began to plot. The same man who had helped destroy Kamakura would soon turn against the emperor. In many ways, Go-Daigo's rebellion was both a brilliant strike and a fatal miscalculation. He shattered the old order, but failed to build a sustainable new one, setting the stage for the turbulent Muromachi era, Ashikaga shogunate, splintered rule. By 1336, Takauji made his move. He seized Kyoto, expelled Go-Daigo, and declared a rival emperor, ushering in the northern and southern courts, period Nanbokucho. He established his own military government in Kyoto, marking the beginning of the Ashikaga shogunate, also known as the Muromachi Bakufu. Unlike the tightly controlled Kamakura regime, the Ashikaga shogunate governed through a web of alliances, often depending on regional warlords rather than direct centralized power. Takauji's rule was pragmatic, but fragile. He appointed Shugo military governors to oversee provinces, granting them considerable autonomy. Over time, these governors evolved into powerful daimyo, ruling their lands almost independently. Kyoto remained a glittering cultural capital, but politically, Japan was fragmented. The emperor still existed, in fact, two emperors did, but the shogun held real military power, albeit loosely. Ashikaga Yoshimitsu, the third shogun, brought a brief golden age in the late 14th century. He skillfully ended the northern and southern courts divide, patronized the arts, built the stunning Kinkakuji, Golden Pavilion, and even opened diplomatic relations with Ming China. Under Yoshimitsu, Kyoto flourished as a cultural center, yet this prosperity masked deeper instability. Provincial lords grew bolder, and the shogunate lacked the coercive strength to rein them in. By the 15th century, the Ashikaga shogunate was more a referee than a ruler. Its inability to maintain strong central control would ultimately plunge Japan into a century and a half of near-constant warfare. The seeds of the Sengoku Warring States period were being sown right under the Muromachi court's elegant eaves. Zen Buddhism and the arts flourish amid political turbulence. A new cultural force swept through Japan. Zen Buddhism. It's brought from China during the Kamakura period. Zen found fertile ground under Ashikaga patronage. Unlike esoteric Shingon or ritual-heavy Tendai, Zen emphasized meditation, discipline, and direct experience of enlightenment. Samurai found this philosophy appealing. Its focus on inner calm and readiness aligned well with the warrior ethos. Zen monks became cultural conduits, bringing Chinese art, architecture, and philosophy to Japan. The shogunate sponsored the construction of serene Zen temples like Tenriji, whose gardens embodied the harmony between nature and human design. The arts flourished in this environment. Ink painting, subokuga, monochrome landscapes, and minimalist aesthetics began to dominate elite taste. This was also the era when the tea ceremony began to take root, influenced by Zen ideals of simplicity and mindfulness. Calligraphy, garden design, and no theater developed in tandem, often supported by shoguns and wealthy merchants alike. Yoshimitsu's court became a center of cultural brilliance, blending Chinese refinement with uniquely Japanese sensibilities. Ironically, even as political power fragmented, cultural unity and innovation reached new heights. Zen helped create a shared elite culture that would influence Japan for centuries. When in war and the collapse of central authority, everything changed in 1467. A dispute over shogunal succession exploded into a full-scale civil war. It's a win-in war. What began as a conflict between two powerful clans, the Hosokawa and Yamana, soon dragged in nearly every major daimyo. Kyoto became a battleground, its elegant palaces and temples reduced to ashes. For 10 brutal years, rival factions fought street by street, while the shogun, Ashikaga Yoshimasa, remained largely powerless and detached, more interested in tea ceremony aesthetics than governance. The war ended in stalemate, but the damage was irreversible. Kyoto lay in ruins, and the shogunate's prestige was shattered. Provincial lords no longer looked to Kyoto for leadership. They ruled their territories independently, raising armies and fortifying castles. Central authority had effectively collapsed. Japan entered the Sengoku period, a century of near-endless warfare where survival depended on military strength, cunning alliances, and sheer luck. This breakdown also gave rise to new kinds of leaders. Local samurai and even ambitious peasants could seize power if they proved capable. The age of courtly politics was over. In its place emerged a raw, brutal competition for domination that would reshape Japan's landscape, socially and politically. Sengoku period, Japan in chaos. The Sengoku period c. 1467 to 1600 was an age of warlords. Daimyo carved out autonomous domains, constantly waging war for territory, resources, and power. Alliances were made and broken in rapid succession. Castles rose across the landscape, serving as both military fortresses and administrative hubs. Technological innovations like the widespread use of firearms after the Portuguese arrival in 1543 transformed the nature of warfare. Amid the bloodshed, figures of immense charisma and ambition emerged. Some daimyo sought mere survival. Others dreamed of unifying the fractured realm. Peasants, monks, pirates, and mercenaries played their parts in the ever-shifting theater of conflict. The Sengoku era was not only a time of war but also of social mobility, innovation, and daring political experiments. Religious movements like the Ikowaiki, militant Buddhist sects, challenged samurai authority. Merchant cities like Sakai thrived as quasi-independent powers, leveraging trade and wealth to protect their autonomy. Amid this chaos, Japan's medieval feudal structure evolved into something sharper and more pragmatic. It was a Darwinian battlefield, and only the most ruthless, brilliant, or lucky would survive to shape the nation's destiny. Oda Nobunaga, the ruthless innovator in the mid-16th century, Japan was a patchwork of warring domains. Into this fractured landscape stepped Oda Nobunaga, minor daimyo from Owari province, who would forever change the face of Japan. Initially underestimated as the Fool of Owari for his eccentric behavior, Nobunaga revealed himself to be a military genius with a cold, calculating vision. He moved swiftly to consolidate his home province, defeating rivals through a mix of strategic brilliance and ruthless pragmatism. His true breakthrough came at the Battle of Okayazama in 1560, facing Imagawa Yoshimoto's vastly superior army. Okayazama Nobunaga launched a surprise attack during a thunderstorm, routing the enemy and shocking the nation. This victory cemented his reputation and set the stage for his meteoric rise. Unlike traditional warlords bound by feudal customs, Nobunaga embraced innovation. He reorganized his armies, promoted talented commoners, and adopted new technologies like the arquebus, matchlock guns, introduced by the Portuguese. Nobunaga's approach to power was uncompromising. He crushed Buddhist warrior monks who opposed him, most infamously at Mount Hiei in 1571, where his forces burned down the great monastery and slaughtered thousands. He understood that to unify Japan, he needed to dismantle both military and religious resistance. His economic reforms were equally transformative. He standardized weights and measures, encouraged free markets, and broke down barriers between provinces to increase trade. By the late 1570s, Nobunaga controlled central Japan, installed a puppet shogun in Kyoto, and was laying the groundwork for nationwide dominance. His capital at Azuchi symbolized his vision, a gleaming fortress city that fused military might with political theater. Yet Nobunaga's ambition was so immense that it ultimately bred enemies on all sides. In 1582, during the incident at Hanaji, he was betrayed by Akechi Mitsuhide and forced to commit seppuku, leaving his dream unfinished, but not undone. Toyotomi Hideyoshi, from peasant to ruler after Nobunaga's death. The vacuum of power was quickly filled by his most brilliant general, Toyotomi Hideyoshi. Born a peasant, Hideyoshi's rise was nothing short of legendary. Through wit, charisma, and strategic genius, he climbed the ranks from sandal-bearer to military commander. He avenged Nobunaga by crushing Mitsuhide at Yamazaki, and then outmaneuvered rival generals to claim control of Nobunaga's vast domains. 8. By 1585, Hideyoshi had secured the title of Kampaku Imperial Regent, effectively becoming ruler of Japan. Hideyoshi's genius lay not just in warfare but in diplomacy and administration. He skillfully negotiated with resistant daimyo, often using marriages, hostages, or titles to bring them into his fold without unnecessary bloodshed. He launched military campaigns that extended his influence over Kyushu and Shikaku, bringing almost the entire country under his authority by 1590 after the decisive siege of Odawara against the HJ clan. What made Hideyoshi unique was his ability to bridge the gap between old feudal traditions and a new centralized state. He maintained the imperial court's prestige, lavishly sponsoring cultural projects, tea ceremonies, and castle construction, while simultaneously enforcing strict military control. His Osaka castle was an architectural marvel, symbolizing his unrivaled authority. Though born a peasant, he wielded power with the grandeur of an emperor. Yet beneath this glittering surface lay ambition that stretched beyond Japan's shores. Having unified the country, Hideyoshi sought new conquests abroad, ambitions that would lead to his most audacious gamble, the invasion of Korea. Sword hunts and castle towns as Hideyoshi consolidated power. He understood that stability required more than battlefield victories, it needed social control. In 1588, he issued the famous Sword Hunt Edict, ordering all weapons to be confiscated from peasants and religious institutions. Officially, this was to melt them down to build a giant Buddha statue. In reality, it was a shrewd move to prevent uprisings and solidify samurai authority. By disarming the commoners, he froze the class hierarchy. Samurai would fight, peasants would farm, and merchants would trade, no more fluidity. Simultaneously, Hideyoshi transformed the physical landscape of Japan through the creation of castle towns. He ordered daimyo to build their residences near their castles, attracting merchants, artisans, and laborers to settle nearby. These castle towns became bustling economic hubs, linking military power with commerce and administration. Roads were improved, river routes secured, and toll barriers reduced, allowing goods and people to flow like never before. Hideyoshi also carried out the Taiku Land Survey, meticulously assessing agricultural output to standardize taxes and consolidate state control. For the first time, Japan had something resembling a national economic system, with clearly defined classes and administrative oversight. These measures created a remarkably stable domestic order, even as Hideyoshi's gaze turned toward foreign conquest. Invasions of Korea, ambition beyond Japan. In 1592, Hideyoshi launched a massive invasion of Korea, intending to use the peninsula as a stepping stone to conquer Ming China. He marshaled an army of over 150,000 soldiers, one of the largest mobilizations in Japanese history, and unleashed it across the sea. Initially, Japanese forces moved with stunning speed, capturing Seoul within weeks. Their gunpowder weapons and disciplined formations overwhelmed Korean defenses. However, the invasion soon bogged down. Korea's naval hero Yi Sun-sin turned the tide with brilliant naval tactics, using turtle ships and strategic ambushes to cut off Japanese supply lines. The Ming dynasty sent reinforcements, and the campaign descended into brutal stalemate. After years of bloody fighting and immense cost, Hideyoshi's forces withdrew. A second invasion in 1597 fared no better. By the time Hideyoshi died in 1598, his imperial dreams had crumbled, leaving Japan exhausted and stretched thin. Despite its failure, the Korean invasions had profound consequences. They showcased Japan's newfound military power to the world, strained the daimyo financially, and exposed the limits of personal ambition in foreign conquest. Hideyoshi's death left a power vacuum, and many daimyo quietly prepared for the inevitable clash to determine Japan's next ruler. Tokugawa Ieyasu and the Battle of Sekigahara. In the turbulent years following Toyotomi Hideyoshi's death in 1598, Japan teetered on the edge of another civil war. Hideyoshi's infant son Hideyori was far too young to rule, so a council of 5 regents was appointed to maintain order until he came of age. Among these regents, Tokugawa Ieyasu stood out as the most formidable. A seasoned warlord from Mikawa Ieyasu had long mastered the art of waiting. While other daimyo exhausted themselves in reckless campaigns, Ieyasu built alliances quietly, strengthened his economic base in the fertile Kanto region, and kept a watchful eye on every political maneuver in Kyoto. Tensions escalated quickly between Ieyasu and Ashita Mitsunari, Toyotomi loyalist and brilliant bureaucrat who despised Tokugawa's growing influence. Mitsunari rallied daimyo who remained loyal to Hideyori, forming what became known as the Western Army. While Ieyasu gathered his allies into the Eastern Army, it was not just a clash of armies, but of visions. One faction wanted to preserve Toyotomi authority, the other aimed to usher in a new Tokugawa order. Both sides began mobilizing in 1600 as Japan collectively held its breath for the confrontation that would decide its destiny. The stage for the decisive battle was the foggy plains of Sekigahara, located in present-day Gifu Prefecture. On the morning of October 21, 1600, a thick mist enveloped the battlefield, concealing the positions of tens of thousands of troops. Ieyasu commanded around 75,000 men, while Mitsunari had roughly 80,000. Both armies were a patchwork of daimyo, many of whom were playing a dangerous game, some waiting to see who would win before committing. As the fog lifted, the rumble of drums and the blare of conch shells signaled the beginning of one of the largest and most decisive battles in Japanese history. What made Sekigahara extraordinary was not just the scale, but the strategic intrigue. Ieyasu had spent weeks secretly negotiating with several Western-aligned daimyo, including Kobayaka Hideaki, promising rewards if they switched sides. At a critical moment during the battle, Kobayakawa's forces, positioned on a hill overlooking Ieyasu's right flank, suddenly turned their weapons on their supposed allies. This betrayal sent shockwaves through Mitsunari's ranks. One by one, other daimyo followed suit, defecting to Tokugawa's side and collapsing the Western Army's cohesion. By midday, the once balanced battle had turned into a rout. Ishida Mitsunari's forces broke and fled as Ieyasu pressed the advantage. Mitsunari himself was captured days later, humiliated and paraded before being executed. The battlefield was littered with thousands of corpses, a grim reminder that Japan's fate had been decided in a single day. In the aftermath, Tokugawa Ieyasu moved with calculated precision. He stripped defeated daimyo of their lands, redistributed territories to loyal supporters, and consolidated power with minimal resistance. Unlike Nobunaga's fiery conquests or Hideyoshi's audacious campaigns, Ieyasu's victory was the culmination of patience, manipulation, and masterful timing. By 1603, Tokugawa Ieyasu was officially granted the title of Saite Shogun by the emperor, cementing his position as Japan's supreme military ruler. His victory at Sekigahara did more than win a battle. It ended the Sengoku Warring States period and laid the foundation for over 2 centuries of Tokugawa rule. Tokugawa shogunate would bring relative peace, stability, and isolation, shaping the cultural and political identity of Japan for generations to come. Sekigahara wasn't just a clash of armies. It was the decisive pivot point between centuries of chaos and a new era of order. Establishing Edo, a new era begins when Tokugawa Ieyasu emerged victorious at Sekigahara. His power was immense but not yet absolute. Japan had endured centuries of civil war, and rival lords still controlled vast domains. To secure his rule, Ieyasu needed more than just military might. He needed a new political center. In 1603, after being appointed Ciat shogun by the emperor, he established his government in Edo, a relatively obscure fishing village in the Kanto Plain. Strategically located and far from the old aristocratic capital of Kyoto, Edo would become the beating heart of the Tokugawa shogunate over the next few decades. Transformed from a marshy outpost into one of the largest and most sophisticated cities in the world. The new shogunate operated under a carefully crafted feudal hierarchy, known as the Bokkun system, a blend of centralized control and semi-autonomous regional domains. Daimyo were allowed to rule their lands, but were bound by strict loyalty to the shogun. Ieyasu cleverly rewarded his allies with lucrative provinces while reducing or relocating potentially rebellious lords to strategically weaker positions. To ensure loyalty, the shogunate enforced a series of legal codes, alliances, and marriages that knitted the ruling class into a single political fabric. One of Ieyasu's most brilliant administrative moves was the Sankenkadai system, formalized later by his successors. Under this policy, daimyo were required to spend alternating years in Edo and their own domains, leaving their families behind in Edo as hostages to guarantee good behavior. This constant movement drained the daimyo's resources, kept them busy with logistics, and ensured that Edo remained vibrant with the presence of Japan's elite. Over time, this policy not only consolidated Tokugawa control, but also stimulated infrastructure, as highways, post towns, and inns flourished along the routes connecting Edo with the provinces. Edo itself rapidly became a symbol of Tokugawa stability. Urban planning was meticulous. Moats, canals, and streets were laid out to facilitate defense and governance. Around the shogun's castle grew a bustling city filled with samurai residences, merchants, districts, entertainment quarters, and temples. By the mid-18th century, Edo's population surpassed 1 million, rivaling London and Beijing. Despite the rigid hierarchy, Edo was a place of dynamic social interaction, where samurai, artisans, and townspeople developed new cultural forms. Ieyasu died in 1616, but his legacy was secured. His successors, Hitada and Amitsu, solidified the shogunate's control through decisive policies and cultural patronage. The Edo period would last for more than 250 years, a remarkable era of internal peace after centuries of bloodshed. From this fortified yet flourishing city, the Tokugawa clan would rule Japan with a blend of military authority, bureaucratic precision, and cultural patronage. The Sakoku policy, closing the country. By the 1630s, Tokugawa Amitsu, Ieyasu's grandson, faced growing unease about foreign influences. European traders, particularly the Portuguese and Spanish, had brought not only firearms and goods, but also Christian missionaries, who were converting thousands of Japanese. Initially tolerated, Christianity soon became seen as a destabilizing force, threatening the loyalty of daimyo and commoners alike. The Tokugawa leadership, obsessed with maintaining order, viewed foreign religion and politics as intertwined dangers that could undermine their carefully balanced system. In response, the shogunate introduced the Sakoku, Sogo, or closed country policy. This series of edicts culminating in 1639 severely restricted foreign contact. Japanese were forbidden from traveling abroad, returnees faced execution, and foreign ships were largely barred from Japanese shores. The Portuguese were expelled, and Christianity was brutally suppressed through persecution, forced renunciations, and executions. What remained was a tightly controlled system of limited trade through Nagasaki, primarily with the Dutch, Chinese, and Koreans, who were seen as less politically threatening. This isolation was not total, rather it was selectively permeable. The Dutch were confined to the artificial island of Dejima, where they traded under strict surveillance, providing the shogunate with goods, information, and occasional medical knowledge. Chinese merchants operated under similar restrictions. Trade continued, but it was carefully monitored, ensuring that the shogunate maintained total control over foreign influence. The result was a uniquely insulated society that still benefited from external contact on Tokugawa terms. The Sakoku policy had profound effects on Japanese society. Without foreign wars or invasions, the country focused inward, cultivating distinctive cultural developments. Political stability underpinned agricultural growth, population expansion, and urbanization. At the same time, Japan missed much of the technological revolution transforming Europe during the 17th and 18th centuries. While isolation preserved social order, it also created a technological and diplomatic time capsule, setting the stage for the shock of Western arrival centuries later. For more than 2 centuries, Sakoku defined Japan's identity. It was a conscious act of national self-preservation, born from fear of colonial domination and internal upheaval. The shogunate's cautious policies allowed Japan to flourish in its own way. It's untouched by wars that ravaged other parts of the world. Yet this isolation was a double-edged sword, one that would eventually be shattered by black ships on the horizon. Life in Edo Japan: peace, prosperity, and class. Under the Tokugawa regime, Japan experienced something extraordinary: more than 250 years without major internal warfare. This unprecedented peace transformed daily life. Society was rigidly structured into 4 main classes: samurai, peasants, artisans, and merchants, with movement between classes nearly impossible. The samurai, once fierce warriors, became bureaucrats and administrators, serving in government posts rather than on battlefields. Their swords remained symbols of status more than tools of war. For peasants, life revolved around agriculture. Villages were tightly organized, with collective responsibility for tax payments and behavior. High rice yields sustained the economy, and surplus rice was converted into wealth that flowed through merchant networks to cities. Artisans produced goods ranging from lacquerware to swords, while merchants, despite being officially low in status, became economic powerhouses, controlling trade and finance across domains. This inversion of wealth versus status quietly reshaped social dynamics over time. Urban centers like Edo, Osaka, and Kyoto thrived as bustling hubs. Edo was the administrative center, Osaka became the commercial capital, and Kyoto remained a cultural and imperial city. Life in these cities was vibrant. Theaters, tea houses, sumo arenas, and bustling markets offered entertainment and goods to commoners and elites alike. Literacy rates climbed, partly due to temple schools, making Edo, Japan one of the most literate pre-modern societies in the world. Books, woodblock prints, and popular fiction circulated widely. Despite the rigid hierarchy, life was not static. Economic pressures, famines, and occasional uprisings tested the shogunate's governance. Samurai often struggled financially as fixed stipends failed to keep pace with inflation, leading some to fall into debt to merchants. Meanwhile, prosperous peasants and merchants found subtle ways to display their wealth through clothing, architecture, and cultural patronage, quietly bending the social rules without openly defying them. This structured yet dynamic society created the conditions for a cultural flowering unlike anything Japan had seen before. With war absent and urban life flourishing, people turned their energies toward the arts, pleasure, and innovation. Edo period Japan was not merely stable, it was alive, buzzing with creativity, ambition, and everyday drama. Urban culture, kabuki, ukiyo-e, and floating worlds. As cities grew, a distinct urban popular culture blossomed in Edo, Osaka. This culture revolved around the ukiyo floating world, the vibrant pleasure quarters where people temporarily escaped rigid social roles. In these districts, actors, courtesans, poets, and commoners mingled in ways unimaginable in official society. Here, art, fashion, and entertainment thrived, shaping Japan's identity for centuries to come. Kabuki theater emerged in the early 17th century as a bold, colorful form of performance that blended drama, music, and dance. Initially created by women, it was soon taken over by male actors after the authorities banned female performers. Kabuki plays dramatize both historical events and contemporary urban life, often with spectacular costumes, exaggerated gestures, and emotional intensity. Audiences from all walks of life pack theaters, making Kabuki a central pillar of popular entertainment. Equally transformative was ukiyo-e, the woodblock print art that depicted courtesans, actors, landscapes, and scenes of daily life. Affordable and mass-produced, these prints captured the spirit of the floating world and spread it far beyond pleasure quarters. Artists like Hokusai and Hideyoshi would later elevate this art form into timeless masterpieces, but even in its early forms, ukiyo-e reflected a dynamic visual culture, democratizing art in unprecedented ways. Tea houses, poetry contests, fashion trends, and seasonal festivals all contributed to this rich cultural ecosystem. Merchants and artisans became cultural patrons, commissioning works that celebrated their world. The floating world was both an escape and a mirror, a space where the realities of urban life were exaggerated, beautified, and sometimes critiqued through satire and wit. This thriving culture revealed a paradox of the Edo period, while society was rigid on paper. Cultural life was exuberantly fluid. In theater and art, people explored identity, pleasure, and imagination without directly challenging political authority. The result was a uniquely Japanese urban modernity, centuries before industrialization would arrive. Smugglers, scholars, and Dutch learning, despite official isolation. Curiosity about the outside world never disappeared. Smugglers operated along the coasts, trading contraband with Chinese and Southeast Asian merchants. These unofficial networks brought in goods, ideas, and sometimes even people, creating quiet leaks in the Sakoku walls. Meanwhile, intellectuals turned their attention to the one sanctioned window to the outside world, the Dutch traders on Degama. Through careful interaction with the Dutch, Japanese scholars developed Rangaku Dutch learning, a body of knowledge encompassing Western medicine, astronomy, engineering, and geography. Rangaku scholars painstakingly translated Dutch texts, experimented with foreign technologies, and disseminated new ideas through limited but powerful networks. By the 18th century, Rangaku had fostered a scientific subculture within the rigid Tokugawa framework. Some domains encouraged this learning more than others. Forward-thinking daimyo established schools and invited scholars to apply Western techniques to practical problems. These pockets of knowledge became seeds of modernization long before Japan officially opened its doors. At the same time, the shogunate kept a watchful eye, balancing curiosity with caution. Smugglers, too, played a role in this intellectual exchange. Their illicit trade often brought books, instruments, and technologies that bypassed official controls. Though technically criminals, they became inadvertent conduits of innovation, keeping Japan connected, however faintly, to global currents. By the late Edo period, Japan was not a completely sealed box, but a complex ecosystem of regulated isolation and selective engagement. When Western ships finally arrived demanding trade in the mid-19th century, they encountered a society that was isolated politically but intellectually alert, ready in some corners to absorb and adapt new knowledge at astonishing speed. Western encroachment. Black ships on the horizon. By the mid-19th century, the world outside Japan had changed drastically. European empires and the United States were expanding their influence across Asia, seeking new markets and strategic footholds. Steamships now plied global routes, and industrialization had given Western powers overwhelming military and technological superiority. Japan, meanwhile, had been under Sakoku isolation for over 2 centuries, society stable but technologically behind the industrial West. For many Japanese, the outside world existed only in filtered fragments through Dutch traders at Nagasaki. In 1853, this uneasy distance shattered when Commodore Matthew Perry of the United States Navy sailed into Edo Bay with a squadron of 4 modern warships, their black-painted hulls belching steam, their cannons gleaming. The Japanese called them Kurofun, the black ships, and their arrival created a shockwave. The Tokugawa shogunate, accustomed to controlling all foreign contact, suddenly faced a power whose demands could not simply be ignored or expelled. Perry presented a letter from U.S. President Millard Fillmore, demanding that Japan open its ports for trade, provide safe harbor for American whalers, and establish diplomatic relations. The shogunate, uncertain and internally divided, stalled for a year, hoping to buy time. But Perry returned in 1854 with an even larger fleet, making it clear that resistance would be futile. After tense negotiations, the shogunate signed the Treaty of Kanagawa, opening to ports and establishing formal relations with the United States. It was a modest agreement on paper, but symbolically, it marked the end of Japan's isolation. The shock was profound. For the common people, the sight of towering steamships and foreign sailors was unprecedented. For samurai and officials, it raised alarming questions about Japan's military vulnerability. Western powers, noticing Japan's concession to the Americans, quickly demanded similar treaties. Britain, Russia, France, and others followed in rapid succession. The old world of carefully managed isolation was collapsing under the weight of gunboat diplomacy. Perry's arrival did not simply open Japan's ports. It shattered the Tokugawa shogunate's aura of control. For centuries, the regime had maintained authority through the perception of order and unchallengeable leadership. Now, in the face of foreign power, that image cracked, setting off political tremors that would soon become full-blown earthquakes. Unequal treaties and internal unrest. Following the Treaty of Kanagawa, Japan was drawn into a web of unequal treaties, modeled after those imposed on China. These treaties granted foreign powers extraterritorial rights, meaning their citizens were not subject to. Japanese law fixed low import tariffs and opened more ports to trade. The 1858 Harris Treaty with the United States was particularly damaging, effectively making Japan a semi-colonial state without formal occupation. Britain, France, and other Western powers quickly secured similar terms. For the Tokugawa shogunate, these agreements were humiliating but unavoidable. They lacked the military strength to resist and the diplomatic leverage to negotiate on equal footing. Yet their decision to acquiesce enraged many powerful factions, particularly anti-foreign samurai and domains like Satsuma and CHSH, who saw the treaties as a betrayal of national sovereignty. The slogan "Sanjay Revere the Emperor," "Expel the Barbarians," gained traction, channeling both nationalist and anti-shogunate sentiment. The political structure of the Tokugawa regime was ill-suited to handle this crisis. Factions within the shogunate debated how to respond. Some advocated cautious modernization, others wanted to double down on traditional isolation. Meanwhile, foreign powers demanded more privileges, and their naval ships loomed threateningly offshore. Riots, assassinations of foreigners, and violent incidents like the Namamugi Incident 1862 intensified tensions. Sometimes drawing foreign military retaliation, economic and social pressures compounded the unrest. The sudden influx of foreign goods destabilized traditional markets, causing inflation and hardship for peasants and merchants. Samurai stipends lost value, increasing dissatisfaction among a class already squeezed by economic changes. Urban populations exposed to new ideas and technologies grew restless as they witnessed the old order faltering. This volatile mix of humiliation, economic disruption, and ideological fervor created fertile ground for revolutionary movements. While foreign powers assumed Japan might follow China's path of semi-colonial subjugation, many Japanese elites saw the situation differently. They believed the only way to preserve sovereignty was to overthrow the shogunate and rapidly modernize under imperial leadership. The stage was set for one of the most dramatic political transformations in Japanese history: the fall of the Tokugawa, the Boshin War. By the 1860s, the Tokugawa shogunate's authority was crumbling. Reform efforts under Shogun Tokugawa Yoshinobu came too late to restore confidence. Anti-shogunate domains, particularly Satsuma and CHSH, formed secret alliances to resist both foreign domination and Tokugawa power. These domains modernized their armies with Western weapons and training, ironically preparing to use foreign technology against the regime that had signed the unequal treaties. In 1867, under immense pressure, Tokugawa Yoshinobu formally returned power to the emperor in an act known as the Taisei Hikan, but this move was partly strategic. Yoshinobu hoped to retain significant influence in a new government framework. Anti-Tokugawa forces, however, saw this as an opportunity to eliminate shogunal power entirely. Tensions escalated, and in 1868 the Boshin War broke out between forces loyal to the shogunate and those rallying behind the young Emperor Meiji. The conflict was brief but decisive. Modernized imperial forces, equipped with rifles, artillery, and Western military organizations, swiftly defeated shogunate troops in key battles such as Toba Fushimi. Many Tokugawa loyalists surrendered or switched sides as imperial victories mounted. The war culminated in the surrender of Edo Castle, peacefully handed over by Yoshinobu, preventing widespread destruction of the city. The Boshin War was not merely a civil conflict. It represented a seismic shift in political legitimacy. For centuries, the shogun had ruled in the emperor's name, but now the emperor's supporters seized real power. The victory of the imperial faction ended the Tokugawa shogunate after more than 250 years and set the stage for the Meiji Restoration. The speed and relative bloodlessness of the transition astonished observers. In less than 2 years, a centuries-old military government collapsed, replaced by a movement that promised modernization, national unity, and resistance to foreign domination. The fall of the Tokugawa was both an end and a beginning, the close of the feudal era and the dawn of a new, ambitious Japan. The Meiji Restoration. Emperor returns to power. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 marked a turning point unlike any other in Japanese history. After centuries of being a ceremonial figurehead, the emperor, now Emperor Meiji, became the symbol and rallying point for a new national government. The young leaders from Satsuma, CHSH, and other reformist domains acted in the emperor's name to dismantle the old feudal order and build a centralized, modern state. One of their first acts was the abolition of the Han system, the feudal domains, placing it with prefectures directly governed by the central government. Daimyo were compelled to return their lands and were compensated with government positions or pensions. Samurai too saw their privileges steadily dismantled. Their stipends were phased out, and their right to wear swords in public was eventually banned. These reforms eliminated the power base of the old warrior class and paved the way for a merit-based bureaucracy and conscript army. The new government sent missions abroad. Most famously, the Iwakura mission, 1871 to 1873, to study Western institutions and technologies. They imported not just machines, but entire systems. Legal codes from France and Germany, a constitutional monarchy modeled on Europe. Railways and telegraphs, modern schools, and military academies. At the same time, they launched massive infrastructure projects and encouraged industrialization, transforming cities and rural landscapes alike. The restoration was not universally welcomed. Samurai uprisings, like the Satsuma Rebellion 1877 led by Seigo Takamori, challenged the new order, lamenting the loss of tradition. But these revolts were crushed by the modern conscript army, demonstrating that the balance of power had irreversibly shifted. The emperor became a national icon, while real authority rested in the hands of the oligarchs known as the Genro, who guided the state's rapid modernization. In a remarkably short time, Japan had gone from a fragmented feudal state to a centralized modern nation, driven by a sense of urgency. To survive in a world dominated by imperial powers, Japan had to transform or perish. The Meiji Restoration was less a return to ancient rule than a strategic reinvention, blending tradition with modernization to carve out a new place in the global order. Modernization, trains, guns, and factories. The Meiji leaders understood that modernization was not optional. It was the price of survival. They launched an all-encompassing program to transform Japan's economy, military, and society. Railways and telegraph lines spread rapidly across the islands, shrinking distances and integrating markets. The first railway line between Tokyo and Yokohama opened in 1872, a symbol of Japan's embrace of modern technology. New ports and shipyards enabled the construction of a modern navy, while modern roads and factories reshaped the landscape. Industrialization followed a unique path. Rather than relying on private entrepreneurs alone, the government played a leading role by establishing state-owned model industries, from textiles to shipbuilding. Once these industries became profitable, they were sold to private families, the emerging zaibatsu conglomerates, such as Mitsubishi, who would dominate the economy for decades. This public-private strategy accelerated Japan's industrial base, creating a modern economic engine almost from scratch. Modernization also transformed society. Universal education was introduced, spreading literacy and technical knowledge across all classes. A modern conscript army replaced samurai warriors, training peasants into soldiers with modern weapons. The class system was legally abolished, and new opportunities emerged for ambitious individuals, though inequalities remained. Western clothing, architecture, and customs began to appear in cities, creating a striking visual blend of tradition and modernity. Not everything was smooth. Rapid change caused dislocation and unrest in some areas. Taxes on farmers rose to fund state projects, leading to peasant protests. Industrial workers faced harsh conditions. Intellectuals debated how much of Western culture Japan should adopt versus preserve. Yet despite these tensions, the overall trajectory was clear. Japan was hurtling forward, determined to stand shoulder to shoulder with the great powers. By the end of the 19th century, Japan had achieved what few non-Western nations had. It had transformed itself from an isolated feudal society into a modern industrial state, capable of competing on the world stage. The black ships that once forced open its ports had unintentionally sparked a revolution that would soon make Japan a power to be reckoned with. Meiji reforms and industrialization. The Meiji era marked one of the most extraordinary transformations in world history. In just a few decades, Japan went from a feudal, isolated archipelago to a modern, industrialized power. The Meiji leaders understood that survival in a Western-dominated world required radical change. Feudal domains were abolished, the samurai class lost their privileges, and the emperor was repositioned as the symbolic head of a modern state. The slogan Fukoku Kyohei enriched the country, strengthened the military, became the guiding principle of the new Japan. To achieve this, Japan aggressively imported Western knowledge. Missions were sent abroad to study political systems, industrial methods, and educational practices. Railroads crisscrossed the country, telegraph lines connected distant regions, and modern banking institutions emerged. The government built factories to jumpstart industries, from textiles to shipbuilding, before gradually selling them to private entrepreneurs, giving rise to the powerful zaibatsu conglomerates such as Mitsubishi and Sumitomo. The social structure shifted dramatically. The samurai found themselves stripped of stipends and status, often forced into new careers as bureaucrats, teachers, or businessmen. Commoners gained new opportunities through universal education and conscription, which tied them more directly to the state. Western dress, architecture, and customs became fashionable among elites, symbolizing a nation racing toward modernity while still rooted in its traditions. The Meiji government also instituted sweeping political reforms. In 1889, Japan promulgated the Meiji Constitution. Establishing a constitutional monarchy with an elected parliament, the Diet, though real, power remained concentrated in the hands of oligarchs. This gave Japan the outward appearance of a modern state, helping it secure recognition and respect from Western powers. These reforms laid the foundation for the emergence of a powerful, centralized state that could stand toe-to-toe with imperial powers. But modernization was not merely about technology or institutions. It was about identity. For many Japanese, the late 19th century was a disorienting time. Old traditions clashed with new values, and the balance between modernization and cultural preservation became a constant tension. The rapid pace of change would soon fuel both national pride and imperial ambition. Sino-Japanese and Russo-Japanese wars, Japan's new military might, was soon put to the test. In 1894, tensions with China erupted into the First Sino-Japanese War. The Qing dynasty, long considered the dominant power in East Asia, was humiliated. Japan's modern army and navy achieved swift victories, seizing control of Korea and parts of Manchuria. The Treaty of Shimonoseki in 1895 granted Japan, Taiwan, and other concessions, announcing to the world that Japan was now a major regional power. However, Japan's triumph was tempered by the so-called Triple Intervention. Russia, Germany, and France forced Japan to give up some of its hard-won gains. This humiliation fueled resentment and a determination to prove Japan's strength on the global stage. Over the next decade, Japan and Russia competed for influence in Korea and Manchuria, culminating in the Russo-Japanese War of 1904–1905. This conflict was a watershed moment. For the first time in modern history, an Asian power decisively defeated a European empire. The Japanese Navy's stunning victory at the Battle of Tsushima shocked the world, signaling that the balance of power was shifting. The Treaty of Portsmouth, mediated by U.S. President Theodore Roosevelt, recognized Japan's control over Korea and parts of southern Manchuria. The victories transformed Japan's international image. It was no longer a curious, rapidly modernizing state. It was an empire builder. At home, national pride soared, but so did imperial ambition. The military gained immense prestige, and expansionism became increasingly seen as Japan's destiny. Yet beneath the triumph lay growing tensions. The costs of war strained the economy, and social unrest brewed among workers and peasants who felt excluded from the benefits of empire, Taisho democracy, and cultural shifts. The early 20th century brought the Taisho era, a time of political experimentation, social change, and cultural vibrancy. Emperor Taisho's ill health allowed political parties and the Diet to gain more influence, leading to what historians often call Taisho democracy. For a time, Japan experienced a flowering of parliamentary politics, with cabinets formed by elected parties rather than appointed elites. Urbanization accelerated as cities swelled with workers, students, and intellectuals. Cafes buzzed with new ideas. Socialism, feminism, anarchism, and liberalism all found audiences among young Japanese who questioned traditional hierarchies. Women became increasingly visible in public life, not just as factory workers, but as writers, activists, and students. This was the era of moga, the modern girl, a symbol of changing gender roles and cultural openness. Japan's economy boomed during World War I, as European powers were distracted by the conflict, allowing Japanese industries to dominate Asian markets. However, this rapid growth was followed by a post-war recession, labor strikes, and rural poverty. Political tensions simmered between the military, oligarchs, and emerging political parties. But for a brief period, Japan seemed to be moving toward a more open, pluralistic society. Culturally, the Taisho period saw unprecedented creativity. Western art, music, and literature mingled with Japanese traditions to create new hybrid forms. Modernist movements in literature and visual arts flourished. Intellectuals debated democracy, nationalism, and individualism with a passion that would shape the ideologies of the coming decades. Yet Taisho democracy was fragile. Economic instability, natural disasters like the Great Kanto earthquake of 1923, and fears of communism provided fertile ground for reactionary forces. By the late 1920s, the pendulum began to swing back toward authoritarianism, setting the stage for the rise of militarism in the Showa era. Showa Rise. Militarism and expansion. The Showa era began in 1926 under Emperor Hirohito. Initially, Japan was a constitutional monarchy with a vibrant political scene, but deep economic depression and nationalist fervor gave rise to militarism. Many believed that civilian politicians were corrupt and weak, unable to lead Japan in a world dominated by imperial powers. The military, particularly the army, began to dominate national policy, often acting without government approval. The turning point came in 1931 when the Kwantung Army engineered the Mukden Incident, seizing Manchuria without official sanction. This bold act marked the beginning of Japan's aggressive imperial expansion. Manchukuo, a puppet state, was established under the nominal leadership of Puyi, the last Qing emperor. The League of Nations condemned the invasion, but Japan simply withdrew from the organization, signaling its willingness to go its own way. Throughout the 1930s, militarists consolidated their power through assassinations, coups, and intimidation of political opponents. Civilian governments were replaced by military-dominated cabinets. Education and media were infused with militarist and nationalist propaganda. Glorifying sacrifice and obedience to the emperor, Japan positioned itself as the leader of a new Asian order, a greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, but this vision was built on conquest and exploitation. Expansion into China escalated in 1937 with the Marco Polo Bridge incident, leading to the Second Sino-Japanese War. The conflict was brutal, marked by atrocities such as the Nanjing Massacre. Japan's ambitions now extended far beyond Manchuria, sought to dominate all of East Asia, as the military machine grew ever bolder. Tensions with Western powers tightened, especially over access to vital resources like oil and rubber. World War II. From Pearl Harbor to Hiroshima by the early 1940s, Japan stood at a crossroads. Faced with embargoes from the United States and other Western powers, its leaders made a fateful decision. Rather than retreat, they would strike first. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, crippling the U.S. Pacific Fleet and propelling America into World War II. The attack was a stunning tactical success, but strategically, awakened a sleeping giant. Japan quickly expanded across Southeast Asia and the Pacific, capturing territories from the Philippines to Indonesia. For a brief period, the empire seemed unstoppable. But the tide began to turn at the Battle of Midway in 1942, where the U.S. Navy dealt Japan a devastating blow. From then on, the Allies pushed relentlessly toward the Japanese home islands through brutal island-hopping campaigns. The Japanese military adopted a strategy of total war, mobilizing the entire population. Kamikaze pilots, indoctrinated to die for the emperor, became symbols of desperate resistance. Cities were firebombed, industries were strained, and food shortages worsened. By 1945, Japan was facing inevitable defeat. The atomic bombings of Hiroshima and Nagasaki, combined with the Soviet declaration of war, forced Japan to surrender unconditionally on August 15, 1945. The war left Japan devastated. Millions dead, cities reduced to ashes, and its empire dismantled. Yet, this cataclysm would set the stage for an equally astonishing post-war transformation from a defeated aggressor to a peaceful global power. American occupation and new constitution. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the nation lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble, industries were destroyed, and millions were homeless. Into this void stepped the Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Though nominally a multinational effort, in reality, the United States directed the transformation of Japan from a militarist empire into a democratic state. The occupation was both punitive and transformative. War criminals were tried at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, with prominent military and political leaders executed or imprisoned, yet the Emperor Hirohito was spared, a calculated decision to maintain social stability. Hirohito renounced his divine status in 1946, marking a profound symbolic break from Japan's imperial past. A new constitution was drafted under intense American guidance, but with input from Japanese officials. Ratified in 1947, it enshrined democratic principles, sovereignty of the people, civil liberties, women's suffrage, and an independent judiciary. Most strikingly, Article 9 renounced war and prohibited Japan from maintaining armed forces, though a self-defense force would later emerge in practice. This new legal framework fundamentally reshaped Japan's national identity. Land reforms broke up large estates, empowering tenant farmers and weakening the old elite. Education was democratized, censorship lifted, and labor unions flourished. Economic reforms encouraged decentralization and entrepreneurship. The occupation authorities also implemented cultural changes, promoting freedom of expression and dismantling ultranationalist institutions. However, the occupation was not merely altruistic. With the onset of the Cold War, U.S. priorities shifted from reforming Japan to using it as a strategic ally against communism. Economic recovery and political stability became paramount. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, Japan had not only adopted a democratic system, but was poised to embark on an astonishing economic comeback. Economic miracle, from ashes to industry. The post-war years witnessed what historians call the Japanese economic miracle. From the 1950s to the early 1970s, Japan experienced one of the fastest sustained economic growth rates in history. Factories that once produced weapons were converted to manufacture consumer goods. Government-to-industry cooperation, high savings rates, and technological innovation propelled Japan into the ranks of the world's leading economies. The Korean War, 1950 to 1953, provided an unexpected boost. U.S. military procurement orders flooded Japanese industries with capital, jump-starting production and exports. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry MITI became a key architect of Japan's industrial strategy, guiding investment into sectors like steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, and electronics. Companies like Toyota, Sony, and Honda emerged as global giants, embodying Japanese craftsmanship and innovation. Society transformed rapidly. Urbanization accelerated as millions moved from rural areas to cities in search of work. Bullet trains symbolized speed and modernity, while neon lights illuminated bustling metropolises like Tokyo and Osaka. A new middle class emerged, enjoying consumer luxuries unimaginable in the immediate post-war years: televisions, cars, and Western-style homes. Education played a critical role. Japan invested heavily in universal high-quality education, producing a skilled workforce that drove industrial expansion. Work culture became intense, long hours, company loyalty, and lifetime employment defined the era. This dedication helped Japan dominate industries worldwide, from automobiles to electronics, earning both admiration and anxiety from Western nations. By the late 1960s, Japan's GDP was soaring. Hosting the 1964 Tokyo Olympics symbolized its rebirth, a dazzling display of modern infrastructure, technological prowess, and cultural confidence. From the ashes of war, Japan had reimagined itself as an economic superpower. Culture boom, anime, technology, and globalization. Economic strength fueled a vibrant cultural renaissance. As industries boomed, Japan became a global exporter, not just of cars and gadgets, but of culture. The post-war generation, raised amid prosperity and exposed to global influences, began shaping new artistic movements that would leave a worldwide impact. One of the most significant cultural exports was anime and manga. Creators like Osamu Tezuka revolutionized storytelling through works such as Astro Boy, laying the foundation for an industry that would captivate audiences across the globe. By the 1980s and 1990s, anime films like Akira and Studio Ghibli's masterpieces introduced international audiences to distinctly Japanese narratives and aesthetics. Manga became a global phenomenon, influencing art, fashion, and entertainment far beyond Japan's borders. Simultaneously, Japan became synonymous with cutting-edge technology. Sony's Walkman changed how people consumed music. Nintendo transformed gaming with iconic franchises, and advances in robotics fascinated the world. Japanese urban life, blending ancient temples with neon skyscrapers, became a symbol of the future itself. Pop culture reflected a society negotiating between tradition and innovation. Subcultures flourished from Harajuku street fashion to punk-inspired youth movements. Japanese cuisine, cinema, literature, and design gained international acclaim. What had once been an insular society was now shaping global tastes and trends. Globalization flowed both ways. Foreign influences were adapted, remixed, and made uniquely Japanese. Hollywood films inspired anime. Jazz and rock were given local twists. Western architecture merged with minimalist Japanese aesthetics. By the late 20th century, Japan was not just part of the global conversation, it was leading it. The lost decades, economic stagnation. After decades of meteoric growth, Japan's economic miracle came to a sudden halt in the early 1990s. The cause lay in a massive asset bubble that had inflated throughout the 1980s. Real estate and stock prices soared to absurd levels at one point. The land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was said to be worth more than all of California. When the bubble burst in 1991, it triggered a prolonged economic slump known as the Lost Decades. Banks were saddled with bad loans, businesses faltered, and consumer confidence plummeted. Deflation set in, creating a vicious cycle of stagnation. The government attempted stimulus after stimulus, but recovery was sluggish. Japan's once mighty corporations struggled to adapt to a changing global economy, facing rising competition from South Korea, China, and other emerging economies. Social consequences were profound. Lifetime employment systems began to erode. Younger generations faced job insecurity and declining wages, while older workers clung to traditional corporate structures. A sense of malaise settled over society, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, grinding stagnation that reshaped national attitudes toward risk, ambition, and the future. Yet, Japan remained a wealthy, technologically advanced country. Infrastructure, healthcare, and education continued to excel. Cultural exports like anime and video games flourished even as economic growth slowed. The lost decades forced Japan to re-examine its economic model and cultural identity, prompting gradual reforms in finance, labor, and governance. Japan today, tradition meets the future in the 21st century. Japan stands as a fascinating blend of deep-rooted tradition and cutting-edge innovation. Ancient shrines coexist with towering skyscrapers. Centuries-old festivals are live-streamed worldwide. And high-speed trains glide past rice paddies that have been cultivated for millennia. This duality defines modern Japan, a nation constantly balancing preservation with progress. Technologically, Japan remains at the forefront in robotics, sustainable energy solutions, and infrastructure. Its cities are models of efficiency and cleanliness. At the same time, cultural heritage is fiercely protected. Tea ceremonies, sumo wrestling, kabuki theater, and Shinto rituals continue to thrive, not as relics, but as living traditions woven into daily life. Demographic challenges loom large. An aging population and declining birth rate pose serious questions about the future of the workforce, immigration policy, and social welfare systems. But these challenges have also spurred innovation, from elder care robots to urban revitalization projects aimed at younger generations. On the global stage, Japan remains a major economic and cultural power. It plays a crucial role in diplomacy, technology, and climate initiatives. Its soft power continues to expand through media, cuisine, and design. Whether through anime streaming services or culinary trends, Japan's influence reaches nearly every corner of the world. Modern Japan is not simply a postscript to its imperial past. It is a nation that has repeatedly reinvented itself from mythic islands to imperial power, from ruin to economic titan, and from isolation to global cultural leader. Its story is one of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring interplay between the old and the new. American occupation and new constitution. When Japan surrendered in August 1945, the nation lay in ruins. Cities were reduced to rubble, industries were destroyed, and millions were homeless. Into this void stepped the Allied occupation, led by General Douglas MacArthur, the supreme commander for the Allied powers. Though nominally a multinational effort, in reality, the United States directed the transformation of Japan from a militarist empire into a democratic state. The occupation was both punitive and transformative. War criminals were tried at the International Military Tribunal for the Far East, with prominent military and political leaders executed or imprisoned. Yet the Emperor Hirohito was spared, a calculated decision to maintain social stability. Hirohito renounced his divine status in 1946, marking a profound symbolic break from Japan's imperial past. A new constitution was drafted under intense American guidance, but with input from Japanese officials. Ratified in 1947, it enshrined democratic principles, sovereignty of the people, civil liberties, women's suffrage, and an independent judiciary. Most strikingly, Article 9 renounced war and prohibited Japan from maintaining armed forces. Though a self-defense force would later emerge in practice, this new legal framework fundamentally reshaped Japan's national identity. Land reforms broke up large estates, empowering tenant farmers and weakening the old elite. Education was democratized, censorship lifted, and labor unions flourished. Economic reforms encouraged decentralization and entrepreneurship. The occupation authorities also implemented cultural changes, promoting freedom of expression and dismantling ultranationalist institutions. However, the occupation was not merely altruistic. With the onset of the Cold War, U.S. priorities shifted from reforming Japan to using it as a strategic ally against communism. Economic recovery and political stability became paramount. By the time the occupation ended in 1952, Japan had not only adopted a democratic system, but was poised to embark on an astonishing economic comeback. Economic miracle, from ashes to industry. The post-war years witnessed what historians call the Japanese economic miracle. From the 1950s to the early 1970s, Japan experienced one of the fastest sustained economic growth rates in history. Factories that once produced weapons were converted to manufacture consumer goods. Government-industry cooperation, high savings rates, and technological innovation propelled Japan into the ranks of the world's leading economies. The Korean War in 1950 to 1953 provided an unexpected boost. U.S. military procurement orders flooded Japanese industries with capital, jump-starting production and exports. The Ministry of International Trade and Industry (MITI) became a key architect of Japan's industrial strategy, guiding investment into sectors like steel, shipbuilding, automobiles, and electronics. Companies like Toyota, Sony, and Honda emerged as global giants, embodying Japanese craftsmanship and innovation. Society transformed rapidly. Urbanization accelerated as millions moved from rural areas to cities in search of work. Bullet trains symbolized speed and modernity, while neon lights illuminated bustling metropolises like Tokyo and Osaka. A new middle class emerged, enjoying consumer luxuries unimaginable in the immediate post-war years: televisions, cars, and Western-style homes. Education played a critical role. Japan invested heavily in universal high-quality education, producing a skilled workforce that drove industrial expansion. Work culture became intense: long hours, company loyalty, and lifetime employment defined the era. This dedication helped Japan dominate industries worldwide, from automobiles to electronics, earning both admiration and anxiety from Western nations. By the late 1960s, Japan's GDP was soaring. Hosting the 1964 Tokyo Olympics symbolized its rebirth, a dazzling display of modern infrastructure, technological prowess, and cultural confidence. From the ashes of war, Japan had reimagined itself as an economic superpower. Culture boom, anime, technology, and globalization. Economic strength fueled a vibrant cultural renaissance. As industries boomed, Japan became a global exporter, not just of cars and gadgets, but of culture. The post-war generation, raised amid prosperity and exposed to global influences, began shaping new artistic movements that would leave a worldwide impact. One of the most significant cultural exports was anime and manga. Creators like Osamu Tezuka revolutionized storytelling through works such as Astro Boy, laying the foundation for an industry that would captivate audiences across the globe. By the 1980s and 1990s, anime films like Akira and Studio Ghibli's masterpieces introduced international audiences to distinctly Japanese narratives and aesthetics. Manga became a global phenomenon, influencing art, fashion, and entertainment far beyond Japan's borders. Simultaneously, Japan became synonymous with cutting-edge technology. Sony's Walkman changed how people consumed music. Nintendo transformed gaming with iconic franchises, and advances in robotics fascinated the world. Japanese urban life, blending ancient temples with neon skyscrapers, became a symbol of the future itself. Pop culture reflected a society negotiating between tradition and innovation. Subcultures flourished from Harajuku street fashion to punk-inspired youth movements. Japanese cuisine, cinema, literature, and design gained international acclaim. What had once been an insular society was now shaping global tastes and trends. Globalization flowed both ways. Foreign influences were adapted, remixed, and made uniquely Japanese. Hollywood films inspired anime. Jazz and rock were given local twists. Western architecture merged with minimalist Japanese aesthetics. By the late 20th century, Japan was not just part of the global conversation, it was leading it. The lost decades, economic stagnation. After decades of meteoric growth, Japan's economic miracle came to a sudden halt in the early 1990s. The cause lay in a massive asset bubble that had inflated throughout the 1980s. Real estate and stock prices soared to absurd levels at one point. The land under the Imperial Palace in Tokyo was said to be worth more than all of California. When the bubble burst in 1991, it triggered a prolonged economic slump known as the Lost Decades. Banks were saddled with bad loans, businesses faltered, and consumer confidence plummeted. Deflation set in, creating a vicious cycle of stagnation. The government attempted stimulus after stimulus, but recovery was sluggish. Japan's once mighty corporations struggled to adapt to a changing global economy, facing rising competition from South Korea, China, and other emerging economies. Social consequences were profound. Lifetime employment systems began to erode. Younger generations faced job insecurity and declining wages, while older workers clung to traditional corporate structures. A sense of malaise settled over society, not a dramatic collapse, but a slow, grinding stagnation that reshaped national attitudes toward risk, ambition, and the future. Yet Japan remained a wealthy, technologically advanced country. Infrastructure, healthcare, and education continued to excel. Cultural exports like anime and video games flourished, even as economic growth slowed. The lost decades forced Japan to re-examine its economic model and cultural identity, prompting gradual reforms in finance, labor, and governance. Japan today, tradition meets the future. In the 21st century, Japan stands as a fascinating blend of deep-rooted tradition and cutting-edge innovation. Ancient shrines coexist with towering skyscrapers. Centuries-old festivals are live-streamed worldwide, and high-speed trains glide past rice paddies that have been cultivated for millennia. This duality defines modern Japan, a nation constantly balancing preservation with progress. Technologically, Japan remains at the forefront in robotics, sustainable energy solutions, and infrastructure. Its cities are models of efficiency and cleanliness. At the same time, cultural heritage is fiercely protected. Tea ceremonies, sumo wrestling, kabuki theater, and Shinto rituals continue to thrive, not as relics, but as living traditions woven into daily life. Demographic challenges loom large. An aging population and declining birth rate pose serious questions about the future of the workforce, immigration policy, and social welfare systems. But these challenges have also spurred innovation, from eldercare robots to urban revitalization projects aimed at younger generations. On the global stage, Japan remains a major economic and cultural power. It plays a crucial role in diplomacy, technology, and climate initiatives. Its soft power continues to expand through media, cuisine, and design. Whether through anime streaming services or culinary trends, Japan's influence reaches nearly every corner of the world. Modern Japan is not simply a postscript to its imperial past. It is a nation that has repeatedly reinvented itself, from mythic islands to imperial power, from ruin to economic titan, and from isolation to global cultural leader. Its story is one of resilience, adaptation, and the enduring interplay between the old and the new. And that brings us to the end of Japan's incredible journey, from mythical gods stirring the islands out of the sea, to the rise of emperors, the age of samurai and shoguns, the shock of foreign ships, devastating wars, and finally its rebirth as a global power. Across thousands of years, Japan has constantly reinvented itself. It has balanced tradition and innovation like no other nation, preserving ancient customs while leading the world in technology, art, and culture. If you've made it this far, you've just traveled through one of the most complex and fascinating timelines in human history. If you enjoyed this deep dive, make sure to like the video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss the next immersive historical journey. We have countless more stories to tell, bizarre traditions, forgotten empires, strange rituals, and the untold corners of history that rarely make it into textbooks. Thank you for watching, and until next time, stay curious, stay fascinated, keep exploring the forbidden realms of history.